In the last video, we created a class component for our counter, which allows us to increment and decrement our counter. So in this video, we're going to take a look at creating a function component and compare and contrast the differences between a class component and a function component. In order to create this new function component, we do it exactly the same as a class component by coming over and creating a file. And we're going to call this counterhooks.js because hooks, which is a newer feature in React, are what allow us to do all of these fancy things inside of a function component, because before, things such as state were not able to be used inside of function components, but with the use of hooks, we can now do that. So the first thing we want to do is actually import our React. So we can just say import React, and we need to import it from React. And we don't need to import the component part of React because we're not actually using a class component. The next thing that we need to do is actually set up that component. And this is just a function. So we can just say export default. And we can say that we want to export a function, which is called counterhooks. And then inside of this function, whatever we return is going to be the code for our function. So what we can do inside of here is you can just return essentially the exact same code that we have down here. Let's just copy that and paste it in here. And we don't actually want to have these on clicks yet. We're going to add these later. So let's remove these on clicks. And we also don't know how to handle state because, as I mentioned, state is not native to functions. We need to use hooks. So let's just make this default to 0. Now we want to add that into our app. So to do that, we can just come in here and we can import our counter hooks. And we want to import it from our counter hooks. And we can actually just use that down here by saying counter hooks. And we'll just make sure we pass in that prop of initial count, set it to 0. Whoops, 0, just like that. And let's put in a little bit of code so we know that this is our first counter here. And then down here we have our second counter, which is counter hooks. And of course, we need to make sure that we wrap this inside of a fragment since we're trying to return multiple objects. So once we do that, now we can save this. And you can see we have our initial counter up here and our counter hooks as our second counter. And obviously our hooks counter does not work yet. So inside of our hooks counter, what we want to do is first figure out how to get our props, or essentially our initial count that we passed in here, into our counter hooks. And if you remember, the class had a this.props property, but our function does not. Luckily, our function does get the props passed into its function, so we have our props right here. So down here, what we can do is just say props.initial count. And now, if we go into our app, change our initial count to maybe be 3, for example, you see it sets our initial count to 3 here, which is perfect. And a really useful thing that you'll see a lot of the times when you're inside of a React application is when you have very simple props, what'll happen is you use object deconstruction to set the initial count just like this. Now instead of here, we can just remove the props portion and just put initial count. And if we save that, you see it still propagates 3. And if we change this back to 0, it works just as before. We're just using object deconstruction in order to actually make our props easier to read and work with. Now, as I mentioned before, state is not something that's native to a function because a function cannot have state. But with a React hook, we can actually use state. So in order to use state, we just need to import the useState hook, which is just from React. So we just add that to our import up here. And now inside of our function, we can call that useState function. And this is going to take in our initial state, which in our case, we're just going to make this a object, which is going to have a count, and we're going to set that to initial count. So now we actually have state, but how do we use that state? Well, this useState function actually returns to us our state, and it returns it as an array. So what we want to do is deconstruct that array. The first value in the array that it returns is the actual state, and the second thing it returns is a function that allows us to set that state. So we're just going to call it setState here. You can call these variables anything that you want. It really doesn't matter. In our case, the very first thing is our state, so we called it state, and the second thing is the function that allows us to set that state, so we just called it setState. Now inside of here, we can just say state.count, and if we look over here, you see that that's actually being set properly. And the parameter for useState is just our default state. The very first time useState gets called, it's going to default to this object here, and every other time that useState gets called, it's actually going to take the state that is saved, which is going to be updated in our code by our event listeners for our button. And useState at first looks really confusing, but think about useState as essentially the exact same thing as over here where we said this.state equals. That's exactly the same thing as what useState is doing when we call it. And it's returning to us our current state, which would be the same as this.state in a class, and setState, which is the same as this.setState. So now in order to actually use that state, what we want to do is add that click event listener. So we can say on click, we want to call a specific function, And this function inside of here, what we're going to do is we're going to actually use that set state, and we're going to set our state equal to count. We want to set the count property, and we want to set the count property to our current count plus whatever amount we have. So in our case, it's just going to be -1 since this is our decrement button. Now if we save that, you see that we get an error, and that's because count's not defined, and that's because we actually need to use state.count because our state is just going to be an object with a property here of count. Now when we save that, you see it works, and when we click plus, nothing works, but when we click minus, it actually decrements every single time by 1, which is great. We can do the exact same thing down here for our button, which has the plus, and we just want to change this to be +1, and now if we save that, click plus, you see it works, and minus, you see it works. But just like in our class component, setState has the exact same problem, where that if you call it multiple times in a row, it's asynchronous, so it's not going to work properly. So we need to use the previous state, so in our case, previous state, and inside of here, we just want to make sure that we return this state, so it's going to be return. Make sure we wrap this here inside of brackets, so we want to return our count, and we want to use our previous state.count -1. Whoops. Just like this. Make sure all of our brackets line up, and there we go. That's the actual code that we're going to need, and we just need to make sure we use previous state because that's how this .setState works, and it's the same way that setState works. It's asynchronous, so when you use the current state, you need to make sure you are passing in the previous state. Now, this is a little bit clunky since we still need to use our whole object for state, and something that's very nice with hooks is we can actually use whatever we want for our state. So instead of using a full object, let's just make our state a single number, just the count. So now here, instead of returning a full object called state, we're just returning our count. And instead of setting the whole state, we're just coming in here and we're just setting a single count. Now, inside of our onClick, we can remove all of this code, just go back to our single function, and we can just call setCount. And this setCount, like I said, takes the previous state, which in our case is our previous count. So we'll just call it previous count. You can call this variable anything you want. And what it's going to do is it's going to take our previous count and it's going to subtract 1. So over here, we have the exact same thing as setState down here essentially, but instead of using an object, we're just using a single number. And that's really useful because we can break our state up into multiple different variables over here, which is really, really useful. So now let's actually come down here, change this to be just count because we no longer have a state variable. And let's copy this for subtraction down to our plus button and make sure that we actually use plus instead of minus here. And now if we look at our hooks, we can plus by 1 and minus by 1, so it's working perfectly fine. And really the only thing that we changed is our state is now a single number instead of an entire object, which just makes our code easier to write and easier to read. Because if we had multiple things of state, we could actually use multiple useState calls in a row in order to set all of those different states, which is way more easy to use than a whole object that contains all of your state, which is what you must do inside of a class, because classes do not allow you to use hooks in them. Also, something that you're probably a little bit confused by, I know I was when I was learning hooks, is how does it actually save your current state value? Because we obviously know it's working, our plus and minus buttons are working, so somehow our state is being saved, but where in the world is this state being saved? And the way that hooks actually save your state is that they rely on you calling the hooks in the exact same order every single time, and they rely on them being in the very top level of your function. So this means you cannot actually put your hook inside of an if statement. So if we say inside of an if statement here, we want to put our hook and just make sure that we move our const for setting these variables out here. So we have count and set count. So if we try to call our hook inside of here and we save, we're immediately going to get an error. Oh, this is just an uninspected token error. And this is just because I need to make sure that this says let here. And there we go. Now we have an error that says React hook useState is called conditionally. React hooks must be called in the exact same order in every component render. This means you can't put them in ifs, you can't put them in loops, you cannot put them in functions. They have to be at the very top level of your function. And that's how React is able to keep track of which state is which and which hook does what. This is how they can actually store your state. Even though you're inside of a function, it still stores your state globally, so that way it actually knows exactly which state it is based on the order of the useState calls that you have inside of your function here. That's just really important, and for the most part, you really don't have to worry about this because you're always going to be calling these at the top level of your function like this, and as long as you do that, it's going to work perfectly fine. So now let's save that again, make sure everything is working as before, and as you can see, it's working just fine. And again, let's add in our console.log to see how this is actually running. So we can say just here, console.log, and we want to say render counter hooks. And now actually inspect our page. If we go over to our console, we can see we rendered our app, our counter, and then our counter hooks. And every single time we increment counter, you can see it re-renders counter. And every time we increment our counter hooks, it re-renders counter hooks. But it doesn't re-render any of the other components. As I mentioned in the previous video, this is really the power of React and State, is it allows you to re-render just single parts of your application instead of the entire thing every single time something changes. Now let's close out of this, and one last thing I want to do is just look at how counter hooks looks compared to the counter class. So as you can see here, we have a very short 13-line file right here, which has all of our information, and our state is handled in literally one single line. But over in our counter class, you can see here this is much longer, 28 lines. Even if you remove this function, it's still 21 lines, which is significantly longer. And that's because setting up our state requires a significant amount of place because we need to make sure we actually set it in our constructor. And also, we have a bunch of this dots, this dot state, this dot change count. Pretty much everything inside of your class must be prefaced by this dot, which just makes your code more verbose and harder to read, while in our counter hooks version, you see that there's no this dot anything anywhere. It's just all variables that you have inside of your function, which makes it easier to reason with and wrap your head around. So in conclusion, we looked at how to create a functional component by just exporting a function, and everything that that function returns is just going to be the code that is actually rendered, just the same as our counter over here has a render function for our normal class components. We also looked at how to use props, which are just the arguments of the function, as well as state by using the useState React hooks. We also looked at how you need to make sure you always call your hooks in the exact same order every single time, and we looked at how you can actually use anything you want when setting your state, instead of having to always make it an object like you must do over here in the class version. In the next video, we're going to take a look at using context, which allows us to deeply pass our props into a bunch of different components at once without having to manually pass it through every single time. This is really useful for deeply nested components that all need to access a specific variable or prop that's from the top level component. So I hope you're really excited to figure out how context works, because we're going to take a look at that in the next video.